Before we get into today's story, I just want to say, if you're new here, welcome to Crimson Secrets. Hit that subscribe button and join this community, because we tell the kind of stories that stay with you, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city or state you're watching from. I love seeing where you all are. Now, let's get into it. She was standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, when her husband walked in with his tie already knotted and told her she had embarrassed him in front of his entire board. She hadn't said a word at that dinner. She had smiled. She had laughed at the right moments. She had worn the dress he picked out and sat in the chair he pointed to and eaten the food he ordered for her without being asked. And still, somehow, she had embarrassed him. Margaret Calloway Weston, that was the name on her marriage certificate, though her husband had never once introduced her that way. In his world, she was simply my wife. Unnamed, unremarkable, a footnote to a more important story. Her name was Margaret, but for the purposes of this house, this marriage, and the last 6 years of her life, she had become something closer to a shadow. She set down her coffee and looked at him. Really looked, the way you stop doing after a few years of marriage when a person becomes furniture. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." She was not sorry, but she had learned somewhere around year 3 that apologies were the fastest way to end a conversation with Lawrence Weston. Lawrence accepted the apology the way he accepted everything she gave him, without acknowledgement, without gratitude, without even the courtesy of eye contact. He poured himself a glass of water, checked his phone, and left. She listened to the front door close. Then she picked up her coffee again, walked to the window, and watched his car back out of the driveway. And she thought, not yet, but soon. Here is what Lawrence Weston knew about his wife. She had grown up in a small town in western Pennsylvania. Her parents had been school teachers. She had a degree from a state university that she never talked about. She was quiet at parties. She was good at making people feel comfortable. She had no ambition to speak of, or so he believed, and she seemed content to manage the house, attend his functions, and stay out of the way of the life he was actually living. Here is what Lawrence Weston did not know about his wife. Her degree from that state university was a double major in biochemistry and business, completed in 3 years. Her quiet at parties was not shyness. It was deliberate listening. She could read a room in 4 minutes and tell you exactly who in it was lying, who was desperate, and who was the most dangerous person in the space. She had spent the last 2 years, quietly, in the hours between 4 and 7 in the morning, building something real, something that had nothing to do with Lawrence or his board or his carefully knotted tie. And she had been waiting, with a patience that would have frightened him if he'd known it existed, for the right moment to walk away. That moment came on a Tuesday in March, in a hotel lobby in downtown Chicago. Margaret had driven herself there. Lawrence hadn't asked why she needed the car, and she hadn't offered a reason. She had a meeting, a quiet, undisclosed meeting, with a licensing attorney named Arthur Pell, who had been trying to reach her for 3 years, about a trust her grandmother had established in 1987. A trust that, due to a series of circumstances that included a custody dispute, a probate complication, and one extremely stubborn county clerk in rural Ohio, had only recently been fully resolved. She was walking through the lobby, toward the elevator, when she saw them. Lawrence, and a woman in a burgundy coat who had her hand on his arm and her face turned up toward his, like a sunflower tracking light. Margaret stopped walking. She stood completely still in the middle of that lobby, her bag over one-shouldered, and she watched her husband lean down and say something into the woman's ear that made her laugh, a private, intimate sound that carried across the marble floor and landed somewhere in the center of Margaret's chest. She didn't move. She didn't make a scene. She didn't call his name. She didn't reach for her phone. She just stood there and looked at them, at the ease of them, at the way Lawrence touched the small of the woman's back with the casual ownership of someone who had been doing it for a long time. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she had been right. Not yet. She had been telling herself for 2 years now. She turned around and walked back out through the lobby doors. Lawrence never saw her. She sat in her car for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11. because she watched the clock on the dashboard. She wasn't crying. She thought about the first year of their marriage, when she had believed, genuinely, completely, that Lawrence was the kind of man who needed time to open up. That his coldness was armor, not character. She had been patient with him the way you're patient with a difficult season, telling yourself it would pass. It didn't pass, it was just him. She thought about the dinner parties where he corrected her in front of guests. The times he'd answered questions directed at her before she had a chance to speak. The morning he'd come home from a work trip and walked past her without a word, as if she were a coat rack he didn't need that day. She thought about her grandmother, Loretta May Calloway, who had grown up poor and died quietly wealthy, who had run a dry goods store in Claremont, Ohio, for 40 years and reinvested every surplus dollar into land, bonds, and a particular faith that the women in her family were worth more than they were ever told. Loretta had set up that trust in Margaret's name, not her mother's, not her brother's, not the church's. Margaret's, because she had told Margaret once, when Margaret was 9 years old and sitting on the edge of Loretta's kitchen counter, eating a biscuit, "You're the one who pays attention, Maggie. The rest of them are loud, but you watch, and watchers always win." Margaret had been 9. She hadn't understood. She understood now. She started the car. She drove to Arthur Pell's office, sat across from him at his conference table, and signed the paperwork that transferred $11.4 million and approximately 240 acres of property in 3 states into her name. On the way home, she stopped at a drugstore and bought a notebook. She had already been building, but now she would build faster. She did not confront Lawrence that night. This surprised him, she could tell. The faint flicker of expectation when she walked in, the way he watched her face for signs of something. He knew she'd been in Chicago. He didn't know she'd been in the same hotel, but guilt has a particular posture, and Lawrence had never as good at hiding things as he thought he was. "How was your meeting?" he asked. "Productive?" she said. She set her bag down, went upstairs, and ran a bath. She lay in the water and looked at the ceiling and made a list in her head of everything she needed to do. She gave herself 60 days. The company was called Weston Medical Diagnostics. Lawrence had built it over 15 years, or rather, he had funded it and branded it, and hired the people who built it. The distinction mattered to her, though not to him. Lawrence believed that writing checks was the same as doing the work. What he did not know, because he had never once asked, was that Margaret had, in the early years of their marriage, contributed something considerably more valuable than checks. It had started as a favor. A former classmate of hers, a biomedical engineer named Tomas, had asked for her feedback on a diagnostic algorithm he was developing. She had given him 11 pages of notes. He had used most of them. The algorithm was eventually integrated into Weston Medical's core product line, submitted, patented, and filed under Lawrence's company name, because at the time, Margaret had believed it was generous to give that to her husband. She had thought, this is what a good partner does. She had thought, this will matter to him. It had not occurred to her to think, this is mine. But she had kept copies of everything, the emails, the drafts, the handwritten notes from that first weekend she'd spent at the kitchen table, with Tomas's materials spread across every surface. She pulled them out now, all of it, organized by date, and put them in a fireproof box under the bed in the guest room. Then she called a lawyer who was not local and not anyone Lawrence had ever heard of. His name was Vincent Abruzzi, and he practiced intellectual property law out of an office in Philadelphia, and he had a reputation for being very, very quiet until he was ready to not be quiet anymore. She explained the situation. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Calloway, do you still go by Calloway?" "I'll be going back to it, yes," she said. "Miss Calloway," he said, "do you understand what you have here?" "I think so," she said. "That's why I called you days." She moved through them carefully. She did not change her behavior. She attended his functions. She smiled at his colleagues. She went to bed at the same time, and woke up at the same time, and made coffee for 2 every morning, even though the second cup had been sitting cold on the counter for years, untouched, a habit she'd kept up out of something she could no longer name. She found the woman's name by accident, and then by intention. A notification on a shared tablet. a restaurant reservation for two, a name she didn't recognize, and then 20 minutes of quiet searching on her laptop in the guest bathroom. Renata Solis, 41, VP of Sales at a firm that did business with Weston Medical. Not a stranger, an insider. Someone who had sat across from Lawrence at a conference table and then, apparently, at many other tables since. Margaret looked at her LinkedIn photo for a long time. A confident face, good hair, a smile that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. She thought, she doesn't know he corrects his wife in front of guests. She doesn't know he answers questions directed at other people before they can speak. She doesn't know what this is going to cost her. She closed the laptop. She was not angry at Renata Solis. Anger at the other person is something you do when you need somewhere to put the pain that belongs to you. Margaret had decided somewhere in those 11 minutes in the parking garage in Chicago that she was going to hold on to her pain carefully and use it correctly. On day 58, Vincent Abruzzi filed a formal claim of co-authorship on a patent that underpinned 62% of Weston Medical's primary product revenue. On day 59, Lawrence received a certified letter that he opened at his desk, alone, and then read again, and then put down very carefully on his blotter with both hands. The way you put down something fragile after you've realized it's already broken. On day 60, Margaret came downstairs at 7 in the morning with 2 suitcases, not large ones, just enough, and set them by the front door. Lawrence was in the kitchen. He heard the sound of the suitcases and came out into the entryway and looked at her. "What is this?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "I'm leaving," she said. "The divorce proceeds at work will be filed to his office. We'll be in touch about the IP claim. I'd recommend you talk to your attorneys before you talk to me again." The color left his face in stages, like water draining. "Margaret, I know about Renata," she said, not bitterly, not loudly, just cleanly, the way you state a fact that doesn't require embellishment. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "I don't need the explanation. I'm not asking for one. I'm telling you so that you understand this is not impulsive. I've known for 60 days. I've had 60 days to think clearly, while you assumed nothing had changed. That gap between what you assumed and what was actually happening is the gap I'm walking through right now." She picked up her bag. "The guest room key is on the kitchen counter. The cleaning service comes Thursday. I've already called them and given them a new point of contact." She had thought, in the days before this moment, that she might feel something dramatic when it arrived. Grief, maybe. Or relief so intense it felt like grief. What she felt was quieter than either of those. She felt like herself. She felt like Margaret Calloway, who had a grandmother named Loretta, who told her that watchers always win, who had a fireproof box under a bed and a Philadelphia lawyer, and $11.4 million, and 240 acres, and a patent claim that was going to take Lawrence Weston's company apart at the seams, unless he was prepared to settle for something that would hurt considerably less. She walked to the front door. "Margaret." His voice was different now. The demand had gone out of it. "Margaret, please. Can we just talk?" She paused with her hand on the door. She turned around one last time and looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just looked at the man who had corrected her in front of guests and answered questions directed at her and walked past her like a coat rack on the days he didn't need her. "You had 6 years," she said. "You had 6 years to look at me and actually see me. I was right here, Lawrence. The whole time." She opened the door. She walked out. She did not look back. The next few months were not clean or simple or triumphant in the way that people who haven't been through it tend to imagine. Leaving a marriage, even a wrong one, even one you've been preparing to leave for 60 deliberate days, is still a kind of grief. It doesn't stop being a loss just because the loss is also a door. Margaret rented a furnished apartment in Cincinnati, near enough to the lawyer, far enough from everything she was dismantling. She unpacked her 2 suitcases. She put Loretta's photograph, the one she'd carried in her bag for 6 years, a small black and white of a woman, in an apron standing in front of a storefront, with her arms crossed and her chin up, on the windowsill where she could see it. In the mornings, she worked. She worked harder than she had in years, because now there was no pretending to work around Lawrence's idea of who she was. She corresponded with Vincent every other day. She began, carefully, to think about what she wanted the next chapter to actually look like, not in opposition to Lawrence, not as revenge, but as something built entirely from what she herself valued. She thought about the land in Ohio, 240 acres of it, including 12 acres that backed up against a wetland preserve. She'd driven out there once, years ago, with Loretta, and Loretta had walked the perimeter of the property in sensible shoes and pointed out every feature she'd bought intentionally: the drainage, the road access, the proximity to a county water line that hadn't been built yet at the time of purchase, but that Loretta, who paid attention, had known was coming. She thought about what could be done with land like that, what could be built there, what kinds of work could happen there that mattered. The idea didn't come all at once. It came the way most real ideas do, sideways, incrementally, through a series of small observations that accumulated into something undeniable. She started making calls, old contacts from graduate school. A woman she'd met at one of Lawrence's functions 5 years ago. A biomedical, research card that Margaret had kept in her wallet, without quite knowing why. A foundation in Columbus that funded rural healthcare infrastructure. She did not announce any of this. She did not post about it. She did not need Lawrence to know what she was building. She did not need anyone to know, yet. She had learned. From Loretta, from 6 years of being underestimated, from 60 days of invisible preparation, that the most powerful work happens in the quiet. The IP settlement came through in September. Lawrence had fought it for a month, then stopped fighting it when Vincent Abruzzi presented the full documentation. And his legal team confirmed that the exposure, if it went to litigation, would threaten not just the patent, but the credibility of the entire product line with their hospital partners. The settlement was not public. The number was significant. Margaret didn't tell anyone what it was. She called Vincent and thanked him. He said, "It was a straightforward case, Miss Calloway. You had the receipts." She laughed. A real one, the kind she hadn't made inside that house in years. And he sounded slightly surprised by it. She sat for a while after she hung up. Outside the apartment window, Cincinnati was doing what Cincinnati does in September. Golden and slightly melancholy, and full of people going somewhere. She thought about Lawrence, not with longing, not with anger. She thought about him the way you think about someone, after enough time has passed, that the hurt has changed into something more useful, a kind of information, a lesson about what she would require from the rest of her life, what she would not settle for again, what she now understood about herself that she hadn't when she was 29, and sitting across from him at a restaurant thinking he was the kind of man who needed time to open up. She hoped, distantly and genuinely, that he would figure out what he'd done. Not for her sake, she didn't need that. But because people who never figure out what they've done tend to keep doing it, and that was a miserable way to live. And whatever else she felt about Lawrence Weston, she did not wish that for him. She picked up her phone and texted her sister in Pittsburgh. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. Tell Mom I'll call Sunday." Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The groundbreaking happened the following May. 12 acres in Claremont County, Ohio, the wetland edge of Loretta's land. Repurposed as the site of a rural diagnostic and preventive care clinic that would serve a county with one of the highest rates of undetected cardiovascular disease in the state. Margaret stood in the field in a pair of boots that Loretta would have approved of and listened to the director of the Columbus Foundation talk about what this clinic would mean for the 11,000 people in the surrounding area who currently drove 45 minutes to the nearest specialist. She wasn't the one speaking. She hadn't wanted to be. She'd funded it, helped design the intake model, connected the right people, and then stepped back and let the work be the loudest thing in the room. Her name appeared nowhere in the press release. She had done that on purpose. She was standing near the back of the small crowd when a woman approached her, one of the county commissioners, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Beverly, who had worked with Loretta decades before. "You're Loretta's granddaughter," Beverly said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Margaret said. Beverly looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "She used to say you were the one who paid attention." Margaret looked out at the 12 acres that had once been her grandmother's field. at the staked ground, and the survey flags, and the small group of people who had gathered to mark the beginning of something. She was right, Margaret said. Beverly nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Margaret stayed, where she was a little longer. The morning was cold and bright, but always smelled like thawing ground and possibility. She thought, I was right here, the whole time. And then she smiled, not for anyone watching, not for a camera, not for a caption, just for herself. And for the woman in the photograph on her windowsill who had taught her, a long time ago in a kitchen with a biscuit, that watchers always win. She was still watching, and she was only just beginning.